September 14, 1876, and Margaret Lindholm stood on 40 acres of Wyoming grassland with $8 in her pocket, watching the last wagon disappear over the eastern ridge. The divorce papers had been final for 3 weeks. The land claim gave her until first snow to establish residence, maybe 6 weeks. The nearest settlement, Sweetwater Ford, sat 12 miles northwest. Nobody there had waved when she'd passed through. Her former husband kept everything except this parcel and $8. The land rolled in subtle waves, broken by a dry creek bed and cottonwoods that marked occasional water. Sagebrush covered everything else. No timber within 5 miles. No saw, nails, or draft animal. Just her, a single-bit axe, 2 wool blankets, a cast-iron pot, and one option left. The temperature that afternoon was 68 degrees. By November it would drop to 15 below zero, sometimes minus 40 when Canadian wind hit the prairie. Everyone knew that. She walked the property at dusk looking for where the land wanted to shelter her. The creek bed dropped 8 feet at its deepest point, curving southeast perpendicular to the northwest wind. Cottonwoods clustered where the cut was shallowest. And along the south bank, where the drop was steepest, the earth had slumped into a natural overhang, almost a shallow cave, protected by 2 feet of sod, with roots so dense you could walk on top. She camped there that night, and by lantern light did the mathematics. A conventional dugout needed logs for roof supports, at least 4 or 8 if you wanted to sleep easy. Logs meant buying them at $2 each or cutting them yourself with tools she didn't have. Every approach required resources she couldn't access. But the overhang changed everything. 3 walls for free. Close off the front, create a roof that would bear weight, and she'd have shelter. The question was how to do it for $8. By morning, she'd walk to Sweetwater Ford. The settlement had 6 dugouts, 1 frame house, a mercantile, and a blacksmith shop run by Otto Schreiber, a German immigrant built like a rain barrel with forearms that seemed borrowed from another species. "Need work," she said. "I'll pump bellows, stack firewood, whatever needs doing. Payment in materials." Otto squinted at her. "Heard about you, the divorce papers and creek bottom land." "That's right. What materials?" "Scraps, bent nails, split boards, wire, anything damaged." He considered this while heating a wagon wheel rim. "You know anything about construction?" "I know about staying alive." By Friday, she'd worked 23 hours at his forge. In exchange, 14 bent nails she'd straightened herself, 23 feet of rusty wire, 4 split boards 3 to 5 feet long, a piece of rusted tin roofing, and 30 feet of frayed rope. "That's $8 of junk," Otto said. "It's exactly what I need." "And what's that?" "Enough." The look on his face suggested he'd already written her obituary. Back at the creek bed, Margaret spread her materials on the ground. To anyone else, junk. But her Finnish father had taught her that every material had properties, and if you understood them deeply enough, you could make them do unexpected things. The overhang measured 9 feet wide, 7 feet deep, with 4.5 feet of headroom at its highest point. She spent 2 days cutting sagebrush and laying it across the top, weaving it into the hanging root system, creating 8 inches of additional insulation. For the front wall, she dug a trench and set her 4 boards as vertical posts, packing them with stones and earth. Between these, she wove sagebrush into a dense lattice that would block wind while allowing light. She used bent nails at critical junctions and wire to bind the structure. The door opening faced east to minimize wind. For the door itself, tight woven sagebrush backed by both wool blankets and held by a sagebrush frame lashed with rope. It wouldn't win any beauty contests, but it was solid. Total construction time, 6 days. Total cost, $8 in trade. It looked like something a very determined beaver might build. On September 28th, Thomas Brennan showed up. He was 41, Pennsylvania-born, farmed in Ohio before the bank took everything in '73, now ran 30 head of cattle on adjacent land. He'd been on the territorial board that approved her claim, though he'd argued against it. "Checking to see if you'd left yet," he said. "Margaret was building a fire ring. Do I look like I've left?" "You look like you're camping." He studied her structure like a man watching someone bail a sinking boat with a teaspoon. "That's not going to keep you alive through winter. First real snow will collapse that ceiling. No chimney means no fire means you're dead by Christmas. I have a fire ring outside." Outside doesn't help at 40 below. Look, when you die out here, and you will, it'll cause problems for all of us. Territorial office will investigate. Maybe decide women can't hold claims. You staying here risks every family trying to make it work. Margaret stood, dusting off her hands. You're right about the chimney, but you're wrong about the rest. With what heat? I'm working on it. He studied her face, and whatever he saw made him uncomfortable. Your funeral, he said, and left. But he'd planted a seed. The fire problem was real. She could survive cold, but not 40 below without heat. An outside fire wouldn't work. Inside without a chimney would suffocate her or burn the place down. The answer came 3 days later while digging a root cellar. Root cellars stayed above freezing because earth held heat. Ground temperature at 6 feet down, even in Wyoming winter, stayed around 45 to 48 degrees. Not warm, but not frozen. If earth held heat that well, could it hold heat she put into it? She began experimenting. She dug a pit 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide directly in front of her shelter. Into this pit she placed smooth river stones from the creek bed. Every morning she built a fire, heated the stones for 4 hours, then rolled them through her doorway. The effect was immediate. The stones radiated heat for 6 to 8 hours. The small enclosed space held that heat even after the stones cooled. Temperature inside stayed 20 to 30 degrees warmer than outside. When it was 35 degrees outside, it was 55 to 65 inside. Survivable. Actually comfortable with blankets. But this created another problem, and Otto identified it when he rode out on October 18th. He found her alive, stacking sagebrush behind her shelter in a pile 5 feet tall and 20 feet long. What's all this? He asked. Fuel, for heating stones. Burns hot, burns clean, burns fast. How much do you need? Through April? Maybe 30 cords equivalent. Otto walked around the pile, doing his own mathematics. You're collecting this where? Within 2 miles. There's enough sagebrush to heat this place for 10 years if I wanted. And you're storing it here, out in the open. That's generally how firewood storage works, yes. He pointed at the sky. 2 weeks ago we got 3 inches of rain in one night. Last January we got 47 inches of snow total. Every time it snows, your fuel pile gets wet. Wet fuel doesn't burn, or burns so poorly you might as well try to heat rocks with your breath. You'll spend half your energy drying out fuel to burn, and the other half wondering why you're always cold. Margaret stared at the pile. She'd been so focused on finding a heat solution that she hadn't thought through the obvious reality. Exposed fuel in Wyoming winter was essentially useless fuel. The snow alone would soak everything. Even if she covered the pile with something, wind would blow the covering off, or snow would pile so deep it wouldn't matter. I need to keep it dry, she said quietly. That's right. And I don't see any solution that doesn't require building a whole separate structure, which you can't afford and don't have time for. Otto wasn't gloating. He looked genuinely sympathetic. Look, you've done better than anyone expected. Made it further than most men would have with $8. But this is the wall. Come winter at my place in exchange for work. Help me through the season. Spring comes, you can try again with better resources. That's charity. That's survival. Pride's a luxury out here. After he left, Margaret sat outside her shelter as the sun dropped and the temperature fell to 41 degrees. She'd solved the shelter problem. She'd solved the heat problem. And now the solution to the heat problem had created a fuel storage problem that was about to undo everything else. The irony was almost funny. Almost. She spent that night inside, warmed by stones she'd heated that afternoon, staring at the woven sagebrush ceiling 6 inches above her face. The space was so small that her breath condensed on the roof and dripped back down. Everything smelled like dirt and smoke and crushed sage. Outside, wind rattled the brush walls. Inside, it was quiet enough to hear her own heartbeat. And that's when she realized she'd been thinking about the problem backward. The question wasn't how to store fuel outside and keep it dry. The question was why she was storing it outside in the first place. She'd built a shelter with 3 earth walls, a sod roof, and 1 brush wall facing the elements. She'd built a shelter so small and contained that stones could heat it for hours. She'd built a shelter that was, in essence, a cave. And what did caves have that conventional houses didn't? Dead space, unused volume, areas where nothing happened because they weren't needed for living. She sat up so fast she nearly hit her head on the ceiling. Her shelter was 7 feet deep. She slept in maybe 4 feet of that space, and even that was generous. The back 3 feet, where the earthen wall curved into the natural overhang, was just empty ground that she used for storing her pot and axe. But that space wasn't exposed to weather. It was already protected. It was dry. By first light, she was moving sagebrush inside. The transformation took 4 days. She divided her shelter into 2 distinct zones using more woven sagebrush as a partition. The front 4 feet became her living space, where she slept, where she brought in heated stones, where she existed. The back 3 feet became fuel storage, completely sealed off from outside elements but accessible through a small opening in the partition she could reach through to grab fuel. But she went further than that. She dug into the back wall of the shelter, excavating another 2 feet into the earthen bank at the rear of the overhang, creating what was essentially a fuel cellar carved into the slope itself. The earth above was still protected by the overhang's roots and sod. The walls were packed earth, and every single stick of sagebrush she stored there was completely protected from precipitation, wind, and temperature swings. The result was a shelter that measured 9 feet wide by 10 feet deep, with the rear 6 feet dedicated entirely to fuel storage, holding approximately 12 to 15 cords equivalent of sagebrush, enough to heat stones through the entire winter with surplus. The living space shrank to 4 feet deep, which meant she had to enter crawling and couldn't stand even on her knees. But it was warm, it was dry, and every piece of fuel she'd need until April was already inside, protected, and ready to burn. Total additional cost, $0. Total additional time, 4 days of digging and rearranging. The innovation wasn't in the construction. It was in recognizing that storage space didn't need to be separate from living space. It just needed to be organized differently than conventional wisdom suggested. On November 2nd, the first real snow came. Not the polite dustings that had fallen twice already, but a legitimate Wyoming storm. 14 inches in 18 hours, driven by winds that gusted to 57 miles per hour according to the measurements recorded at Fort Steele, 19 miles southeast. The temperature dropped to -8 Fahrenheit. Margaret spent the duration inside her shelter, warming stones every morning in her pit, which she'd partially covered with flat rocks to create a protected burning area, and bringing them inside to radiate heat. She pulled sagebrush from her fuel storage as needed, which stayed perfectly dry despite the storm raging outside. When it ended, Thomas Brennan rode out expecting to find a collapsed structure and either a body or signs that she'd fled. Instead, he found Margaret outside her shelter, shoveling snow away from her fire pit with a flat board, her cheeks red from cold but otherwise looking competent and unbothered. "You're alive," he said, and he genuinely sounded surprised. "Did you think I wouldn't be? In that?" He gestured at her shelter, which was now almost invisible under snow, which was exactly what she'd intended. The packed snow was additional insulation. "How are you managing heat?" She explained the heated stone system. He dismounted and looked at her fire pit, then at the shelter opening, then at her with an expression caught between respect and disbelief. "And fuel? You can't be keeping sagebrush outside in this. It'd be soaked." "I'm not keeping it outside." "Where then?" She gestured at the shelter. "Inside. Back section. Built a fuel storage area that holds enough for the whole winter." He stared at her. "Inside the shelter." "That's right. You're living in the same structure where you store your fuel." "Not the same space, partitioned, but yes, same structure." Thomas walked around the site, processing this. Finally, he said, "That's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. Shouldn't work. But it does. But it does." He remounted his horse, shaking his head. "You know what's going to happen now, don't you? Every skeptic in Sweetwater Ford is going to ride out here to see if you're lying. They're welcome to look." And they did. Over the next 3 weeks, 7 different people made the journey. Horace Garrett, who'd been certain she'd be gone by October, Sarah Pritchard, who ran the mercantile and thought women had no business homesteading alone, Otto Schreiber, who'd expected to find her frozen, Catherine and John Walsh, Irish immigrants who'd lost their first winter shelter to fire in '74 and rebuilt at enormous cost, Michael Torres, a Mexican sheep herder who'd been ranching in the territory since before it was a territory, and Rebecca Chen, whose family had come from Canton, working railroad and stayed to farm. Every single one of them walked away quietly, filing the information away for future reference. Because what Margaret had proven wasn't just that you could survive winter in an $8 shelter. She'd proven that if you understood your actual requirements, warmth, dryness, protection, and separated those from assumptions about what shelter was supposed to look like, you could meet those requirements with almost nothing. The shelter wasn't elegant. It wasn't comfortable by any conventional definition. But it worked. And it worked because she'd refused to accept that limited resources meant limited options. Let me pause here and ask you something, because if you're watching this, you're probably interested in more than just survival stories. You're interested in what those stories teach us about self-reliance, about practical knowledge that used to be common and now barely exists. If that resonates with you, if you value documenting these techniques before they're completely forgotten, consider subscribing. This channel exists to preserve exactly this kind of wisdom. The real, tested, historically verified knowledge that kept people alive in conditions most of us can't imagine. Join others who believe this information matters. Winter deepened. By December, the temperature had dropped to -23 Fahrenheit on the coldest night, with an average low of -4 for the month. Margaret's routine became mechanical. Wake before dawn, build fire in the pit, heat stones for 4 hours while collecting more sagebrush from the surrounding area, roll hot stones into the shelter, retreat inside until they cooled, repeat. She ate cornmeal mush, dried beans, and salt pork purchased in small quantities from Sarah's Mercantile with money earned from occasional work at Otto's Forge. It wasn't abundant, it wasn't particularly enjoyable, but it was sufficient. January brought the real test. On the 14th, a storm system moved through that lasted 5 days. The temperature didn't rise above -15 Fahrenheit for 73 consecutive hours. Wind chill made it feel like -45. Snow accumulation reached 31 inches. This was the kind of weather that killed livestock, froze water supplies solid, and trapped families in their homes for days while they burned through firewood reserves they'd spent all summer cutting. Margaret stayed inside almost continuously, heating stones 3 times daily and sleeping between the heating cycles. The fuel stored at the rear of her shelter remained dry and accessible, despite the storm howling outside. The earth walls held. The sod roof supported the snow load. In fact, the deeper the snow got, the better insulated the structure became. And the heated stones, placed strategically around her sleeping area, kept the interior temperature between 48 and 56 degrees Fahrenheit, even while outside hovered at -15. When she finally emerged on the 6th day, after the wind had died and the sun returned, she found 3 feet of snow covering everything. Her fire pit was buried. Her shelter was an anonymous hump in the white landscape. But she was fine. Her fuel reserves were intact. And she'd used approximately 18% of her total stored sagebrush, meaning she had enough for 12 more weeks, even if every single one of them was as harsh as the week just passed. That's when Catherine Walsh showed up on horseback, leading a mule loaded with supplies. Catherine was 39, had buried 2 children in Ireland, and had a face that had forgotten surprise years ago. "John sent me," she said. "Says if you survived that storm in this shelter, you've earned decent food." Brought venison, dried apples, and potatoes. Margaret climbed out. "I can't pay for this." "Not asking. I'm asking you to teach me what you did here. It's just a pit with a roof. It's a pit that survived weather that collapsed Henry Morrison's lean-to. A shelter built for $8 that kept you warmer than families in conventional dugouts burning a cord of wood a week." Catherine dismounted. "Our cabin cost $300 and 4 months of labor. We heat it with a stove that cost $40. On the coldest nights, temperature inside barely reaches 55 because wind comes through gaps and the ceiling's too high to hold heat. You're telling me you match that for $8 in 6 weeks? The situations are different, but the principles aren't. Every woman in Sweetwater Ford has watched you since September. We figured you'd fail, but you didn't. You adapted, found solutions that don't require resources we don't have. I'm asking for knowledge that might keep someone alive." Over 2 hours, Margaret showed Catherine everything: overhang selection, sagebrush insulation, heated stones, and most critically, the integrated fuel storage. Catherine took notes, measuring the fire pit and sketching the layout. "The storage is brilliant," Catherine said. "Everyone builds a structure, then figures out fuel storage separately. You built it into the structure itself. Same roof protects both. Only works for small structures. But most families start with dugouts before cabins. First winter is always hardest. This gives them a viable option that doesn't require months of preparation." Catherine closed her notebook. "I'm going to share this. Not your location, not your personal situation, but the technique. Acceptable?" Margaret considered. "It's acceptable, but tell them it's not easy. Tell them it's not about building cheap. It's about building smart with what you actually have." Word spread. By February, 3 families had modified existing shelters to include integrated fuel storage, reducing their firewood consumption by 30 to 45%. 2 new homesteaders arriving in early March specifically requested information about the design before filing claims. Otto Schreiber built an experimental stone heating pit behind his forge and reported that it maintained indoor temperatures 10 to 12 degrees warmer than his traditional stove while using 27% less fuel. The innovation wasn't revolutionary, it was evolutionary, taking elements that already existed separately and combining them in a way that served the actual needs rather than conventional expectations. Settlers had used earth shelters for centuries. They'd stored fuel for millennia. The insight was recognizing that storage didn't need to be external, that the same principles protecting living space could protect fuel, and that small, efficient spaces could outperform large conventional structures when resources were limited. March brought the thaw. By the 23rd, daytime temperatures reached 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow receded, revealing the landscape Margaret hadn't seen since November. Her shelter, which had been invisible under snow for 3 months, emerged looking weathered but intact. The sod roof had held. The earth walls showed no cracking or erosion. The partition between living and storage space remained solid, and in the back storage area, roughly 40% of her original fuel supply remained untouched, meaning she'd over-collected by a substantial margin, which was better than the alternative. On April 7, 1877, Thomas Brennan rode out with official paperwork from the territorial office. Margaret's 6-month residency requirement was satisfied. The land claim was officially approved, pending her continued presence and improvement of the property. She was now a legitimate landowner in Wyoming Territory. "I owe you an apology," Thomas said, handing over the documents. "I was wrong about everything. Your capabilities, your design, your chances. I judged the approach without understanding the thinking behind it. You were protecting the community. That's reasonable. I was protecting assumptions." He looked at the shelter, still partially dug into the creek bank, still unconventional and strange looking. "Can I ask you something? Did you know it would work, or were you just desperate enough to try anything?" Margaret thought about this. "Both," she said finally. "I knew the principles were sound: earth insulation, heat retention, protected storage, but I didn't know if I could execute them with $8 and no help. The difference between theory and practice is whether you're willing to find out. And if it had failed, then I'd have failed knowing I tried everything I could think of. That felt better than failing because I gave up or did what everyone expected even though I knew I couldn't afford it." Thomas nodded slowly. "There's a name for what you did, you know. The old-timers who've been out here since the 50s, they call it frontier engineering. Not building what you want, but extracting function from whatever exists. Making resources stretch beyond what they should logically accomplish. It's how people survived before there were supply chains and lumber yards and hardware stores. My father called it Finnish stubbornness. Probably amounts to the same thing." He remounted his horse. "What's next? You're approved for the claim, but that shelter isn't a permanent solution. Eventually, you'll need something bigger, more conventional." "Eventually," Margaret agreed. "But not yet. This works for now. And while it works, I can focus on wells, gardens, maybe livestock. Build resources before I build structures. Do things in the order that makes sense, rather than the order people expect." As spring progressed into summer, Margaret did exactly that. She dug a well, striking water at 27 feet. She cleared and planted 3 acres, focusing on hardy crops that could survive Wyoming's short growing season: potatoes, turnips, and wheat. She built fences from sagebrush and wire, protecting her garden from pronghorn and rabbits. And she kept the shelter, using it for storage after she eventually built a small cabin, but only after 2 full years of resource accumulation, by which time she could afford to do it properly. The shelter itself stood until 1884, when Margaret finally dismantled it to reclaim the space for a root cellar expansion. But its influence lasted decades. The integrated fuel storage concept appeared in modified forms across Wyoming, Montana, and Dakota territories. The heated stone system, refined and improved by multiple settlers, became a standard backup heating method for conventional structures. And the broader principle, that resource limitations force innovation rather than prevent it, became part of the regional identity in ways both subtle and profound. There's something worth pausing for in this story, and it's not just the survival aspect. It's the question of what we call poverty versus what we call ingenuity. Margaret Lindholm built an $8 shelter that worked as well as or better than structures costing 30 times as much. Was that poverty or intelligence? Desperation or design? The answer matters because it determines how we view resource constraints, as insurmountable barriers or as catalysts for creative problem solving. If you believe this kind of knowledge deserves to be preserved and passed forward, if you think documenting historical problem-solving approaches has value in our current age, then consider subscribing. We're building a library of forgotten techniques, tested methods, and verified historical solutions. Help keep this knowledge accessible for the next generation who'll need it. Modern analysis reveals fascinating insights. The integrated fuel storage provided advantages beyond weather protection. By storing fuel inside the insulated structure, it remained above freezing and burned more efficiently than frozen exterior fuel. Moisture content stayed at approximately 6% compared to exterior storage, averaging 18 to 24% even under covers. The heated stone system achieved remarkable thermal efficiency. Stones heated to 380 degrees Fahrenheit retained useful heat for 6 to 9 hours. In Margaret's 36 cubic feet of living area, this maintained habitable temperatures, with roughly 1/3 the fuel consumption of a conventional stove heating a 200 cubic foot dugout. The cost-to-performance ratio challenges assumptions. Standard homestead construction averaged $250 to $400 for materials, required 4 to 8 weeks of labor, and committed settlers to a specific structure before they understood local conditions. Margaret's approach cost $8, required 6 weeks, and allowed continual adaptation. The shelter's descendants, in modified and refined forms, appeared throughout the American West for another 30 years. But it's important to understand what made this successful wasn't the specific design, it was the thinking process behind it. Margaret didn't ask, "How do I build a house?" She asked, "What do I need to survive, and what's the minimum resource requirement to meet those needs?" That's a fundamentally different question, and it produces fundamentally different answers. The Chinese concept of wu wei, doing by not doing or achieving through minimal interference, captures something of this approach. So does the Japanese principle of motenai, regret over waste, respect for resources. Even the Lakota understanding of mitakuye oyasin, acknowledging interconnection with everything around you, including the earth you shelter in, reflects the same core truth. Solutions exist within systems, not imposed upon them. You don't conquer the prairie. You find the places where the prairie is already offering shelter and you accept that gift rather than trying to dominate it into submission. Margaret Lindholm lived on her Wyoming homestead until 1903, when she sold the improved property, by then 160 acres with a frame house, barn, well, and producing farm, for $1,100. She moved to Laramie and lived there until her death in 1921 at age 79. Her obituary in the Laramie Boomerang mentioned that she was a pioneer and homesteader, but said nothing about the $8 shelter or the integrated fuel storage system that had influenced regional building practices for decades. But the people who'd learned from her remembered. Catherine Walsh taught the principles to 4 other families. Otto Schreiber incorporated elements into his own home renovation and shared measurements with anyone who asked. Thomas Brennan, when asked advice by new settlers, consistently mentioned that conventional approaches weren't the only options, and that sometimes the best solutions came from asking different questions rather than finding better answers to standard ones. This is what traditional knowledge looks like when it works. Not rigid formulas passed down unchanged, but adaptable principles applied to specific circumstances. The skill isn't in following a blueprint. The skill is in understanding why elements work, what conditions they require, and how to modify them when your situation doesn't match the ideal. Margaret understood this. She didn't try to replicate her father's Minnesota solutions in Wyoming. She took the thinking process and applied it to different materials, different climate, different constraints. That thinking process is what's being lost. We have access to more building information than any previous generation, entire libraries of construction techniques, engineering specifications, and design principles. But we're losing the ability to extract function from limitation, to see constraint as a design parameter rather than a failure condition. We're losing the skill of asking, what do I actually need? And distinguishing that from, what am I supposed to have? Margaret Lindholm's $8 shelter lasted one winter by design. But the questions it answered last indefinitely. Can shelter be affordable? Can storage be integrated? Can small be sufficient? Can different be better? The answers, proven over months of -40 cold and tested by people whose survival depended on getting it right, are all yes. Yes, if you're willing to challenge assumptions. Yes, if you understand principles rather than just copying patterns. Yes, if you measure success by function rather than convention. So here's the final question, the one this story ultimately asks. When you face constraint, whether it's money, time, materials, or circumstances, do you see limitation or catalyst? Do you assume the conventional approach is the only approach? Or do you ask what your specific situation actually requires? Margaret Lindholm chose the second path. She didn't build the shelter everyone expected. She built the shelter her $8 in 6 weeks could actually construct. And in doing so, she proved that intelligence applied to limitation produces innovation that abundance often misses. That's the wisdom worth preserving. That's the knowledge this channel documents. And if this story made you think differently about resources, constraints, or solutions, then I'll ask one more thing. Hit the like button. It helps this content reach people who need to hear it, who might be facing their own version of 40 acres and $8, who deserve to know that their limitations don't determine their options. Their thinking does. Share this with someone who values self-reliance, who respects practical knowledge, who understands that the old ways weren't primitive, they were proven. The frontier may be closed, but the questions it asked are timeless. And the answers are still out there, waiting in stories like this one, if we're willing to listen.